We're beginning the discussion of the death of Miriam. We want to dedicate our class on the occasion of the Shloshim for Carol's mother. Le'ilui nishmas Genendel bat Yosef. And the Neshama should have an aliyah as we continue with our learning. So we're talking about the death of Miriam. So the question is, we know that our tradition tells us that the generation that left Egypt, which was comprised of men between the ages of 20 and 60, about 600,000 of them, many women between the ages of 20 and 60. We don't know how many. Men and women older than the age of 60, which we assume there were however many, and men and women younger than the age of 20, of which we assume there were many. So although we use this number of 600,000 to quantify the number of people who left Egypt, in actuality, the number was much higher than 600,000. Was it 1.5 million? Was it 2 million? We don't know. Those are all guesses. But it was much larger than 600,000. So if you have difficulty conceiving of 600,000 Jews going in the same direction at the same time, so just make it 1 million Jews, make it 1.5 million Jews going in the same, traveling through the desert. It's a little bit difficult to comprehend. That was part of the miracle as well. Now we know that of those 1 million or 1.5 million or 2 million Jews who traveled throughout the desert, that over the last 38 years, 600,000 of them died. And that was the generation that were described as the ones who should have fought going into Eretz Yisrael. They were the ones who transgressed not only with the sin of the golden calf, but also the sin of the Meraglim, of the spies. And accordingly, God said, okay, guys, 1 sin I'm willing to forgive you for, 2 sins I'm not. The fact that you have both sinned by the Egel Hazav, the golden calf, and the Chet HaMeraglim, the sin of the spies, when it came to not going into Eretz Yisrael, so you're going to die in the desert. And we know that indeed they did die in the desert, with the exception of Kalev and Yehoshua, who both were able to go into Eretz Yisrael because they did not sin with the sin of the spies. Even if they had sinned with the Egel Hazav, they did not sin with the sin of spies. Shevet Levi was also able to go into Israel because even though they did sin by the Chet HaMeraglim, they did not sin by the Chet HaEgel. We know that Shevet Levi, the tribe of Levi, they were the ones who assisted Moshe in the Chet HaEgel, in punishing the people. So we know that they went in, and we also know that the women went into Eretz Yisrael, that all of the women went into Eretz Yisrael because they were not involved in the Chet HaEgel, and they were obviously not involved in the Chet HaMeraglim either, as it wasn't their obligation to go out and to wage war. So we have this general belief that all of the women who left Egypt went into Eretz Yisrael. Now, does that mean that there were no women who died in the Midbar? No women who died in childbirth, no women who died from illness, no women who died from sickness? Quite possibly that's indeed what it does mean. That during the 38 years that they were in the desert, Kadosh Baruch Hu watched over them with a providence that was not normal. And even though, yes, women normally, there are women who die in childbirth. We know, Baruch Hashem, that in our generation, it is not nearly what it was in previous generations, but clearly there are women who die in childbirth. There are women who die of illness. But that was not the situation in the Midbar. In the Midbar, God protected the Jewish people. He watched over them. There was no illness. People didn't die of illness. People didn't die of women didn't die in childbirth. The only people who died in the desert were the people who deserved to die because they had sinned by the Chet HaEgel and the Chet HaMeraglim, and individuals who were punished in the desert because they transgressed in another way. They kindled God's anger, which is the expression that's generally used. They complained about this or they complained about that. And we know there were multiple plagues in the desert. You get killed for complaining, yes, right? Right? Only there, right? Multiple plagues in the desert that wiped out thousands of people, right? Thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but thousands of people. So the question that confronts us as we begin to analyze this death of Miriam is, why did Miriam die? Right? If anything, Miriam should have merited to go into the land of Israel. Why? Because look at the Mesiras Nefesh that Miriam had. You know, we have this image, you know, we all have this image from either from childhood or from learning the Chumash that, you know, Moshe was put into this basket that was floated into the Nile, and Miriam was like watching it through the reeds or bulrushes or whatever they're called. But the movie, right? We saw it in the movie, right? We saw it in the movie. So we all have this image. But imagine how dangerous it was for Miriam to have done that, right? For Miriam to have kept an eye on her baby brother. It was dangerous for her to have done that. And yet, nevertheless, she did it. And as a result of that, she was there when Basia pulled the basket out of the water. She was there, and she was there to be able to suggest that she would find someone who could nurse this baby and reunite Moshe with his mother. So Miriam was there for all of these things. She, tremendous Mesiras Nefesh. But we can go back a little bit earlier, even a little bit earlier in the time of Miriam's life. She was the one responsible for Moshe Rabbeinu's birth. What does that mean? She was responsible for Moshe Rabbeinu's birth. She convinced, right, her parents, when the decree was issued that all the boys would be thrown into the river, she was the one who her parents separated, and they said, we're not going to bring any more children into the world. Why should we bring children into the world? They're just going to be killed. And Miriam was the one who was able to persuade them to come back together. And when Amram and Yocheved separated, everybody else separated, because Amram and Yocheved were leaders of the generation. And when Miriam convinced them to go back, so all the husbands and wives got back together again. So Miriam was really responsible for the birth of Moshe Rabbeinu. She was a tremendous Neviah. She was a tremendous prophetess, and she had tremendous faith in HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Okay, she didn't hang out in the bulrushes because she wasn't sure Moshe Rabbeinu would survive. She hung out in the bulrushes because she wanted to see how he would survive. She knew for sure that he would survive, but she wanted to see how he would survive. She wanted to see the miracle that HaKadosh Baruch Hu would bring about. So Miriam was clearly deserving of entering into the land of Israel. And she didn't sin with the Chet HaEgel. She didn't sin with the Chet HaMeraglim. All right, she did sin. What did she do? She spoke Lashon Hara about her brother. What?
Downgraded, not like.
It
wasn't like a Lashon Hara that's nasty. It was like concern.
Lashon Hara doesn't need to be nasty, right? Lashon Hara. I mean, Lashon Hara is speaking in a derogatory fashion, right? She spoke in a derogatory fashion about her brother. Right? You know, everybody has this concept that Lashon Hara, you know, is something false. That's not true. Lashon Hara could be something true. And indeed, Moshe and Zipporah had separated. And Miriam's Lashon Hara brought about punishment for her. She was punished. What was the punishment? She became a mitzorah. She had
of her high level.
What?
Because it was of her high level as a prophetess. I have a hard time.
Whether whether Miriam was punished because of her high level, or whether Miriam was punished because of whatever she spoke Lashon Hara, she was punished. The Torah doesn't hide the transgressions of its leaders. She spoke Lashon Hara, she was punished.
Miriam's death started the pattern, then Aaron died, then Moshe died.
Oh, so it's very interesting. So Raylene is correct, right? Miriam was, not only did Miriam die, but Miriam was the first one to die. Right? Miriam died before Moshe and before Aaron and before Moshe. So you're just compounding the question, right? Not only did Miriam deserve to go in, but she was the first one who died of the three of them. Now, we know why Moshe and Aaron died. And that was because of some transgression that occurred when the rock was struck instead of spoken to. Exactly what that transgression was, there's a debate among the Mefarshim. Some say it was because of the way that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to the Jewish people. He called them rebels. Some say that it was because Moshe Rabbeinu missed the opportunity to sanctify Hashem's name, which a normal person might not be punished for, but if you're on the level of a Moshe Rabbeinu, so indeed you do get punished for such a thing, right? That's probably what Thelma is referring to, that you get punished, for being in that, on such a level. But Miriam, we're not told in the Torah that she did anything that she got punished for with death, or why she wasn't able to go into Eretz Yisrael.
So is that the teaching us a lesson? It says it on the note that her death is juxtaposed to the. We're going to come to that. We're going
to come to that. So obviously, we need to try to understand why Miriam died. Therefore, she wasn't able to go into Eretz Yisrael, and why specifically now? Why at this particular point? Okay, so let's begin. We'll begin with the opinion of the Kli Yakar. Okay, the Kli Yakar, one of the commentaries. And what does the Kli Yakar say? So let's look at verse 1, page 842, chapter 20, verse 1. The pasuk says, "Vayavou b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edah," and the children of Israel, the entire congregation, came midbar Tzin, to the desert of Tzin, b'chodesh harishon, on the first month. This is now a year after they left Egypt. This is the month of Nisan, 38 years after they left Egypt. So they came to the desert of Tzin, Vayeshev ha'am b'Kadesh, and the people dwelt in Kadesh, in this place called Kadesh. Vatamas sham Miriam, and Miriam died there. Vatikaver sham, and she was buried there. Okay, so says the Kli Yakar, look carefully at the verse. If you look carefully at the verse, you will notice that there are two expressions that are being used for the people. The first expression is Edah, and the second expression is Am. Right? The first, right? Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kol ha'edah, and then Vayeshev ha'am b'Kadesh. So Edah is translated as assembly, and Am is translated as people. What?
Is it like witness, assembly?
No, aid is a witness. Edah does not mean wit, right? Edah means an assembly or a congregation or a group. So, says the Kli Yakar, we need to differentiate from the fact that the Torah differentiates between these two. We need to understand the reason for the differentiation. And what does the Kli Yakar say? He doesn't say it on our pasuk. He says it actually a few psukim later. But he mentions that the word Am, when the Torah uses the word Am, it means to indicate a group of people who are doing the wrong thing, who are rebelling or who are complaining. That's the am. And if you go back, the Kli Yakar says you go back and you look at how the Torah describes the complainers, it uses the term am by the complainers. Whether they were complaining because they didn't have bread, whether they were complaining because they didn't have meat, whatever they were complaining about, the Torah uses the word am. And therefore, says the Kli Yakar, in this case, Vayeshev ha'am bikadesh, the am was in Kadesh. Says the Kli Yakar, the am wanted to stay in Kadesh, meaning there was a group of people who were very happy to stay in this place called Kadesh b'midbar Tzin, in the desert of Tzin, that even after the entire generation had been wiped out, and Rashi says Kol Ha'edah means that the entire generation, that the entire people that was alive at that moment, they were the people who were going to go into Eretz Yisrael. That Kol Ha'edah, the complete Edah, because all of those who left Egypt who were destined to die in the desert had already died. So we're not talking about people who should have died already, but we're talking about people who were complainers. Says the Kli Yakar, they were the Rishayim, right? They were the troublemakers among the Jewish people. And what did they say? They said, you know what? Let's stay here in Kadesh. It's nice, right? We have food, we have water. We don't want to. What do we have to go into Israel for? What do we have to battle to go into Israel for? Right? And they didn't even know how difficult it would be to live in Israel. They just said, let's stay here. We have everything that we need here. Kadosh Baruch Hu said, can't let them stay here. I promised to take them into Israel. So what am I going to do? I'm going to make them realize that they can't stay in the desert. And how did the Kadosh Baruch Hu do that? Kadosh Baruch Hu stopped the water supply. Pretty hard to stay in the desert if you don't have water. Kadosh Baruch Hu stopped the water supply. Now, where did that water supply come from? They traveled in the desert for 40 years. Where'd they get water? What do you mean, Miriam?
She would touch the salt water or something and make good water.
Nope. There was something called the Be'er Shel Miriam, the well of Miriam. Where did that well come from? Where did that water come from? So we are told that there was a rock that accompanied Bnei Yisrael through their journey in the desert. And from that rock flowed water. From that rock flowed water in Miriam's merit. Right? Water flowed out of the rock. Okay? Now, an amazing thing that when Bnei Israel traveled, what happened? The rock stopped, right? Producing the water, right? They traveled, they got to the new place, the rock rolled along with them. They got to the new place, what happened? The rock set up shop, boom, water comes out again. And this is how they survived, right? Not only did water come from the rock, but it divided up into 12 streams, and each shevet, each tribe had their own stream. So they were able to have water to drink, they were able to have water for any of their other needs, right? They had the water, right? They wanted to get washed, they had water, right? Everything was there. Kadosh Baruch Hu hears the people say that we're going to stay in Kadesh. He hears the Am complain that they don't want to go into Eretz Yisrael. They want to stay in Kadesh, says the Kli Yakar. And what does a Kadosh Baruch Hu do? A Kadosh Baruch Hu stops the water. But if a Kadosh Baruch Hu stops the water, pasnished for Miriam to stay alive. Why? The water, we're told, the water was in the schut of Miriam. It was in Miriam's merit. And everybody knew that the water was in Miriam's merit. And everyone knew that the clouds that surrounded them were in Aharon's merit. And everyone knew that the man that fell from the Shamayim, that fell from the sky, was in Moshe Rabbeinu's merit. The people knew that. It wasn't a surprise to them. Or wasn't hidden. Gee, they were thinking to themselves, why do we have this water? Right? Why do we have these clouds? Why do we have this man? No, they knew exactly why. So how would it have looked, the Medrash says, if the water had to stop, and the Kli Yakar explains why the water had to stop? How would it look, says the Medrash, if Miriam had stayed alive? It would have caused people to say that what? It would have caused people to say that, well, Miriam is no longer deserving, right? She's lost her status, so to speak. So, you might say, you know what? If I have to choose between being alive and losing my status or dying, I'll take being alive and losing my status. But we're not on the level of a Miriam, a Moshe, and an Aharon. On the level of a Miriam, a Moshe, and an Aharon, this is what happens. So, a little bit perplexing, but based on the Kli Yakar and the Medrash, why did Miriam die? To save face. She died for the betterment of the Jewish people.
She was sacrificed.
Right? So she was sacrificed. We'll have to let's approach this, right? Let's approach this cautiously. All right. She died for the betterment of the Jewish people. Of course, that's what happened. That's a little Jesus-y. We have to talk. That's why I said we need to approach this cautiously. Okay. It's going to get more.
No, but even the Hashem took her.
It's going to get more.
But she didn't have a choice either. She was.
Does anybody have a choice when they're going to die?
Wait, didn't Muhammad do that?
Didn't he do what?
He went and in a body.
No, we know that Miriam died. Miriam died and she was buried. Right? We know that. She didn't go up on a stallion, right? Miriam died and she was buried. We do have other instances in Chumash of people who didn't die. So for instance, one of the famous examples is Enoch, right? The Torah just tells us, he wasn't anymore. We know that Elisha was taken alive to Shemayim in a chariot or whatever.
Moshe and Aaron were kissed.
Right? But they died. They died and they were buried. Right? We know that Moshe and Aaron died and they were buried, and the people knew that. They didn't know where, but the people knew that. So we know that Miriam died and she was buried. It's not like she was taken by God from that perspective, but from the perspective that death basically represents a Kadosh Baruch Hu taking back the neshama. So, okay, that's what happens. The Kadosh Baruch Hu sends the Malach HaMaves. The job of the Malach HaMaves is to take the neshama of the person. That's what the Malach HaMaves does. He has to get the neshama out of the goof. The neshama doesn't want to leave the goof, and the Malach HaMaves has to get the neshama out of the goof.
Didn't you say, though, that your neshama floats around between death and burial, so that if you don't get buried, is your neshama still floating around?
So I said that it's not my idea. The poskim mention it. They say that what? So they say that until the body is buried, the neshama is in distress. Right? The neshama is in distress. It doesn't leave, but until the body is buried, the neshama is in distress. Once the body is buried, so then the neshama spends the first 3 days going back and forth between where Shiva is being observed and the body, because the neshama has a hard time leaving the body. I mean, it's left the body already, but has a hard time separating from the body. And then for the remaining 4 days of Shiva, the neshama hovers at the Shiva house, whatever that means. And then when Shiva is over and we take our walk outside, that famous walk around the block everywhere other than Kings Point, right? Or maybe Riverdale, I don't know, because the blocks are too big or whatever it is, all right? So that idea is a levaya. You are accompanying the neshama, escorting the neshama on this final journey, correct? All right? So yes, there are, if there's a large gap of time between death and burial, the neshama is distressed. That's what we believe.
Burial
And
has to be in the ground area?
as opposed to,
What if you're on the Titanic? What if you're
no.
there will be no burial? Burned. What if
I mean, look, that, you know, I mean, it could be, listen, it could be that, I mean, 9/11, right? 9/11, there were people who died who were never buried because their remains were obliterated. All right?
Does that mean your neshama is never?
No, obviously it doesn't mean that your neshama is never, right? If the goof is destroyed, so the neshama has no goof to connect to anymore, right? If the goof is destroyed, the neshama has no goof. We bury, but it sometimes happens that, you know, I mean, Chas v'shalom, we'd say all the people who were cremated during the Shoah, their neshamos are still, obviously not. Right? I mean, okay. So anyway, this is the idea. I had a very interesting situation, just actually has developed over the last week or so. And that is that in London, there was a family member of somebody who lives here in Great Neck, an uncle of someone who lives here in Great Neck, who died in London, died in the hospital. He was alone. He never had any children. He was married, but never had any children, and actually suffered from some mental issues and never was a member of a Jewish community. And he died in the hospital, and the Jewish community, the Chevra Kadisha, wouldn't bury him until they had proof that he was Jewish, right? Because, you know, it's not like, it's much more controlled in London and in many communities than it is here in America. So for instance, if somebody dies here in America and they want to be buried in a cemetery, and what do? They call up the funeral home. Funeral home says, do you have a plot? Or they're relatives, let's say, right? They call up the funeral home, right? You know, do you have a plot? No. Okay, go buy a plot. So they go to any of these cemeteries and they buy a plot. Does the cemetery ask them, by the way, are you Jewish? Was your deceased, whatever, was he or she Jewish? Right? They don't ask, the cemetery doesn't ask that question, right? You know, they assume that somebody's coming to a Jewish cemetery to bury. Okay, so why are they coming to a Jewish cemetery? Obviously because they're Jewish. Cemetery doesn't bother to ask that question. And as a result of that, we don't know who's buried in these cemeteries. That's why there are organizations and shuls that buy sections to control who's buried in that section. So for instance, if somebody wants to get buried in the section of Great Neck Synagogue, and Great Neck Synagogue has multiple sections, but not just Great Neck Synagogue, I'm sure any synagogue or any society, benevolent society, you have to get a permit from someone who's in charge of that plot, that collection of plots. So, and one of the things that before I give a permit out, I want to make sure that the person is Jewish. Make sure the person is Jewish, who's buried there. Sometimes we've had issues because somebody buys a plot. You know, they buy 12 graves, and the person who bought the plot dies, his wife dies, they're buried there. And now, you know, we're talking a generation later or 2 generations later. And all right, is that person now Jewish who wants to be buried there? Sometimes there are questions. Anyway, so the situation in London, the family, Baruch Hashem, they had family members who were still living in Iran. This man was from Iran. They had family members who were still living in Iran. They were able to secure a letter from the rabbi of Isfahan. Isfahan is a town in Iran who knew the family, right? And they were able to get pictures of the matzevos of this person's mother and father. And we sent them to London, and they agreed to bury him. You know, but it was.
How long did that take?
Sometime, I would say he has not been buried probably for 3 weeks.
That's bad.
Being buried today, right? But hasn't been buried for 3 weeks or longer, you know, because if you're a member of a Jewish community in London, you belong to a shul, so there's no problem because, you know, you're not going to belong to the shul unless you're Jewish, right? The shul doesn't take you as a member unless you're Jewish. So, okay, so we know right away that they know right away you're Jewish. It's not an issue. But he didn't belong to a shul. So the family had to prove that he was Jewish, and it wasn't so clear to the family how to prove, you know, that he was Jewish. How would you prove that you're Jewish? Think about it for a second, right? How, you know, let's say that your children are getting married and they're getting married, you know, I don't know, in Israel, and Israel wants proof that your children are Jewish, right? No, they want, so you need to have a letter, right? You need to have something attesting to the fact that you're Jewish. So a rabbi in America can write a letter or can arrange with a Beit Din to write a letter, something like that. But before the Beit Din will write a letter, they want to know, like, how do you know you're Jewish? Right? So what are you going to say? What do you mean, how do I know I'm Jewish? I got married, you know, in a shul. Lots of people get married in shul who aren't Jewish, believe it or not. Okay? So you have to, bit challenging to prove this. And the family didn't know, but okay, Baruch Hashem, they ultimately did prove it. So I'm not sure even how we got on this discussion, but
She asked about the neshama.
oh, the neshama. Okay, that's how we got on this discussion.
One last little thing. So apparently the Chevra Kadisha in London and the Muslim community got together and they're suing the coroner because she believes they just had a whole article in first come, first serve, and they wanted the body's released within 24 hours, and she refuses to.
Really?
They're suing her. Yeah.
Huh? Baruch Hashem. Baruch Hashem, it's London and not here. That's all, Baruch Hashem. Okay, so, right, so we have this, so Miriam dies. According to what the Kli Yakar and the Medrash say, the reason that Miriam died was for the betterment of the Jewish people. She was sacrificed for the betterment of the Jewish people. I'm a little bit hesitant to use that word sacrifice, but she died for the betterment of the Jewish people.
She won't suffer.
What?
So she won't suffer.
What do you mean, so she won't suffer?
If she's alive and God is punishing the Jewish people and therefore she can't provide water anymore, she would also suffer.
Interesting perspective. Okay. So this idea that Miriam died for the Jewish people gives us all a little bit of the heebie-jeebies, right? In other words, wait a second, that's not our religion, right? We don't believe, or let's put it this way, there is a whole nother religion that grew around this idea that someone died for the sins of that generation. And that continues actually to this day, right? To this day, that expression is used, right? They believe that, right? I'm not saying that they shouldn't believe it, or yes, believe it, no, believe it. I don't talk about anybody else. I'm talking about us. Do we believe it? And not that individual. Or do we believe that righteous people suffer and die on behalf of the Jewish community, on behalf of Jews, right? Do we believe that? So what do you think? Just
Yes.
Of course, yes, right? Of course, yes. Why would Rabbi Palakot be saying it if it wasn't true, right? But I want you to think about, what? Rabbi Akiva died
Martyrs.
in the Asara Haruge Malchus. All right, Thelma is bringing up a very good point, right? The Asara Haruge Malchus, the 10 martyrs of the Jewish people, right? That's what you're mentioning. Yes. Okay, true. That's true.
If we benefit from the merits of others, in other words, we benefit from the merits, why wouldn't we benefit from people not willingly, but why wouldn't we benefit from their deaths? If she was 130, so people die, but we can also benefit from their lives.
Okay, so let me try to develop this theme a little bit. There's an interesting Gemara. The Gemara is mentioned. It's the Gemara in Moed Katan, and the Gemara in Moed Katan says as follows: when was the commandment to burn this para aduma and use its ashes to sprinkle on people who were tamei mace. When was that given? After the gold, right? Correct. After the golden calf, but when after the golden calf? All right. I mean, certainly after the golden calf, because we learned of the relationship between the para aduma and the golden calf. But when did people first need to be tahor? We didn't need to be tahor until there was a mishkan, a tabernacle, right? The mishkan. This is way before, right? We're still in the desert. So we needed to become tahor when there was a mishkan. If you wanted to bring a sacrifice to the mishkan, so you needed to be tahor. So the idea of tahara with the para aduma came about with the construction of the mishkan. When was the mishkan built? What year? Pick a number between 1 and 40.
2.
Year 2, correct. All right. The Mishkan was actually set up on the 1st of Nisan, the beginning of the 2nd year. In other words, 1 year after the Nisan in which Bnei Yisrael left Mitzrayim, 1 year after that, that's when the Mishkan was set up. So they needed the para aduma before that. So within the first year that Bnei Yisrael left Egypt, they were given this commandment of the para aduma. Okay? When did Miriam die?
She died
In the 38th year.
10th and the 10th of Nisan.
Right? In the 38th year. Right? That's when she died. Right? 38th year. Why are they together in Chumash? What did we just finish? We just finished reading about the para aduma, right? Para aduma. I drove you crazy for the last year about the para aduma. And now we're transitioning to the death of Miriam, right? The death of Miriam occurs in Chumash right after the para aduma. But they are separated in chronology by 38 years or so. So why would the Chumash put them together if they were separated chronologically by 38 years? Gemara says there's a particular reason. What's the reason? Says the Gemara. Amar Rav Ami. Rav Ami says, Lama nismacha Miriam. Lama nismacha Mesas Miriam leparshas para aduma. Why was Mesas Miriam put? Were they here somewhere? No. Why was Mesas Miriam put next to the para aduma in Chumash? Meaning, the question, right? Chronologically, they're separate. Why does the Torah record them one after the other? Why does the Torah put the para aduma right by the death of Miriam? So answers the Gemara there, as soon as I focus, right? Lomar lecha, to tell you, ma para aduma mechaperes, just like the para aduma was able to secure atonement for an individual, af misa san shel tzadikim mechaperes. So too the death of the righteous secures atonement. Okay. Whoa. Right? Now, this is not an obscure opinion. This is an opinion that is mentioned multiple times in our tradition, that the death of the righteous bring about atonement for the generation.
What was the para aduma able to secure?
Atonement for the people, right? In other words, what is atonement? What does atonement mean? How do we understand atonement? Atonement means we wipe the slate clean and start over. Atonement literally means, kapara literally means forgiveness. right? Forgiveness. Forgiveness and repentance are not the same thing. In other words, you can repent and not be forgiven, right? Those of you who are married understand that concept, right? Right? I mean, your husbands can repent, but it doesn't mean you're going to forgive them, right? Those are two, right? Those are not necessarily the same thing. Forgiveness and repent, right? Repentance and forgiveness. But kapara has a broader meaning as well. The idea of forgiveness basically means that the slate is wiped clean. And we need to do that when we think about what the para aduma accomplishes. In other words, the para aduma is set up to be mitaher, someone who is tameh. Is being tameh a sin that needs atonement, forgiveness?
No.
Really, because
No.
it's just,
Not unless you're a Kohen or a Nazir. If you're a Kohen or a Nazir and you become Tameh, yes, you have transgressed, because a Kohen is not allowed to become Tameh and a Nazir is not allowed to become Tameh. So if a Kohen or a Nazir becomes Tameh, they have transgressed. Now, it could be that they transgressed against their will.
Yeah.
You know, the Kohen's waiting at the bus stop and somebody sits down next to him and dies and falls over against him. Nothing he could have done about that. So sometimes we transgress what we call ba'ones, right? Ba'ones means we had no control over it, right? That happens. There was my children, one of my children and their family lives in Clifton, New Jersey. Clifton, New Jersey, right next to Passaic, New Jersey, right? Clifton, Passaic is known in the Jewish community as a very observant community, I'll say. Right? Very observant community, what we'll call, what the kids call a yeshivish community, right? And that's the community they wanted to live in, Baruch Hashem, very nice community. Community had a Chinese restaurant, right? My kids used to go out every Thursday night to the Chinese restaurant. They would go out to eat at the Chinese restaurant. There was an article that said that the Chinese restaurant was serving non-kosher meat. The Chinese restaurant was serving non-kosher meat. They closed it down. My kids were like, oh my gosh. Like how many, they were going to go out that Thursday night when the news broke Thursday afternoon. They're going to go to a Chinese restaurant. Okay. So did they transgress? Maybe, right? The investigation, I don't think is finished yet. Was it something they could have controlled? No, because the restaurant had hashgacha. How could they have control? It was beyond. So sometimes you transgress and the circumstances are beyond your control. Often we transgress and the circumstances are within our control, but sometimes they're beyond our control. So the Kohen who's at the bus stop and the guy sits down next to him and dies and falls up against him. Okay, that's ba'onis, but it's still a transgression. You still need kapara for it. Okay? So for the Kohen,
aduma is a kapara.
what?
And the para aduma is the kapara.
So for the Kohen and the
Nazir.
Nazir who transgressed when they became Tameh, so the para aduma is a kapara for them. For anybody else who became Tameh, the kapara is not so much forgiveness for transgressing, but rather reinstating the person to a state of tahara, sort of wiping the slate clean. Okay? Now, says the Gemara, just like the para aduma atones, I'll use the word atones, so too the death of a righteous person atones for the generation. Okay, what does that mean? How does the death of a righteous person atone for the generation? And I mean, what does that mean for us who are Jewish? That the death of a righteous, is that a Jewish concept?
Yeah.
It depends what-
any other religion?
What?
What do we care about any other religion?
Well, is it a concept that predated the belief of this by another religion? In other words, is this a native Jewish belief or not? So,
Obviously it is if it's in the Gemara.
Or is it man's attempt to?
well, obviously it is because it's in the Gemara, says Thelma. Okay, when was the Gemara written?
Yeah, told.
Gemara was written after the Torah. When was the Gemara written year-wise? Tell me. When was the Gemara finally put together?
The second bit of instruction.
The Gemara was finally put together in the year 500 of the Common Era. 500 of the Common Era happens to be 500 years after the death of a particular individual about whom a whole religion has grown based on, in part, he died for our sins. So the fact that it's in the Gemara is not necessarily a proof that it's a native Jewish concept, but it is a native Jewish concept. Right? It is a native Jewish concept, okay? Because remember, the Gemara, which was written down in the year 500 of the Common Era, they called redacted in the year 500 of the Common Era. The traditions of that Gemara have been around for thousands of years, right? We have, from the time that Moshe received the Torah on Har Sinai, there were explanations that were handed down. The Torah Sheba'al Peh. The Torah Sheba'al Peh continued to grow over all of these years. So we believe that this idea that misas tzadikim mechaperes, that the death of the righteous can bring about atonement for people, is a native Jewish concept. Okay, native Jewish. I'll bring some other proofs in a little while, but a native Jewish concept. What I'm curious about is to try to understand how that works. Or is it magic? Is it hocus pocus? In other words, God says, oh, a righteous person died. You know what? I'll wipe out everybody else's transgressions. Or a righteous person is suffering. I'll wipe out everybody else's transgressions. Is that what happens? Is it magical? Is there some kind of logical approach to this? So Rav Kook actually suggests that there is. What does Rav Kook say? Rav Kook says that when a person is alive, the number of people who are fully aware of what that person is very limited. When a person dies, so many more people become aware of what a person was, what a person accomplished. I mean, did you ever go to a funeral and listen to the eulogies and say, yeah, I never knew that person like that, right? Gosh. There's sometimes I go to a funeral and I say, gee, I wish I would have known that person. But often I go to a funeral and say, would my kids ever say that? It's like, right, a different, all right, a different thought. But often I say, wow, because when a person's alive, sometimes these things are not focused on. Says Rav Kook, when a righteous person is alive, a righteous person often by definition is a very humble person. Has a lot of humility. We're assuming that we'll call them the same. Has a lot of humility. And, people are not really aware of how righteous this individual is. When a person dies and people speak about this individual, suddenly so many people become aware of the righteousness of the person. And as a result of that, people change.
To the legacy is what
Says Rav Kook, the legacy of a righteous person, which becomes apparent to a greater number of people when the righteous person passes away, that legacy is what brings about atonement. Because that legacy transforms, transforms the people who hear about it. So I remember when recently the passing of Rav Steinman, Zichrono Livracha, one of was probably at the time that he passed away, the Gadol Hador, the greatest person of our generation from the perspective of, from a Torah perspective. Passed away at 104, okay. So, okay, you hear about, did I know the name Rav Steinman before this? Yes, of course I did. But did I realize the greatness of Rav Steinman before all these things started to appear after his death? And the answer is no. Right, no. Right. Did I know he was a great Talmid Chacham? Yes. right? But then you hear all these stories and all these other things about him, and it changes, the way you relate to an individual, to a legacy, and it inspires.
But that didn't happen with Miriam. It didn't happen because after she died, the people didn't behave differently. They behaved worse. They started complaining.
Rav Kook is not referring specifically to Miriam.
Oh, okay.
Rav Kook is referring to this idea that the death of a righteous person is mechaperes, meaning, according to Rav Kook, the death of a righteous person doesn't magically bring about kapara. It's not like a Kadosh Baruch Hu says, okay, I'll take you as a sacrifice for the sins of everyone else. That's not what our tradition means. According to the way Rav Kook understands this, it means that when people who have transgressed understand the legacy of the righteous person who passed away, they are going to change their ways. It's going to bring about kapara for them because they're going to be impacted by the way in which a person passes away, or by the way in which a person lived, which they become aware of after a person passes away. Now, Rav Kook actually develops this idea in a phenomenal way. He says, when you hear about the legacy of a righteous person, so there are two possible responses to that. One response is, wow, I want to be more like that person. I want to be more humble. I want to be more caring. I want to do more chesed. Right? So you have that approach where people are inspired to change their own behavior. But then there are probably elements, says Rav Kook, about the righteous person that are not attainable by the average Chaim or Shmuel or Rivka or Hanaleh or whatever. There are elements of the righteous person that are only attainable by people who have that level of righteousness. So for instance, to be on the level of a scholar like Rav Steinman was, it's not something that the average person is going to be able to attain. Maybe I can be more modest in my life. Maybe I can be more humble. Maybe I can do more chesed. Maybe I can care more about people. Am I going to reach that level of... So Rav Kook actually says that there are two responses. One response is, what can I do to change? I'm inspired to change based on the life and the death of this individual. And Rav Kook says the second response is, how can I enable the legacy of this individual to continue even if it can't continue with me? In other words, even if I'm not going to be the biggest Talmid Chacham, how can I ensure that the level of scholarship that this great person achieved, how can I assure that in some way that will continue? Rav Kook says that we have both of those elements when we're exposed to the death of a righteous person. What impacts on me directly, and what impacts on me that causes me to say, how can I in some way contribute to this continuity? And Rav Kook, through that, actually explains the second statement in our Gemara, right? Which is much less known than the connection between Miriam and the Paraduma. And what is that next connection of our Gemaras? The Gemara says, Amar Rebbe Elazar. Rebbe Elazar says, Lama nismacha misas Aharon lebigdei kahuna. Why was the death of Aharon connected to the clothing that the Kohen wore, the bigdei kahuna? We haven't gotten to that yet. We will get to the death of Aharon. It's coming up. Right, a couple years, no, it's coming up. Right, we'll get to it. So we'll see, the connection between that they are right next to each other. Why were they connected like this? So he says, Ma bigdei kahuna mechaprin, just like the clothing of the Kohen Gadol is able to bring about atonement, so too the death of a righteous person, in this case, Aaron, brings about atonement. So obviously we have to ask the question, why do I need two sources for this? So Rav Kook answers and says it's relating to these two elements of kapara and of change within us. So for instance, Rav Kook says the para aduma when the para aduma was sprinkled on an individual who wasn't tameh, what happened? He became tameh. In other words, the para aduma only helped certain individuals. There were only certain individuals who were able to, quote, benefit from the para aduma. On the other hand, the Big Day Kahuna atoned for everyone. For certain elements of the Big Day Kahuna, and exactly how the Big Day Kahuna atoned for something. In other words, the Kohen put on a particular garment that brought about atonement. How does that work? We'll have to talk about that. But the Big Day Kahuna works for everybody. So says Rav Kook, these two elements are what's expressed in this idea. There are certain things that apply to everybody. In other words, when a tzaddik dies and we learn about the legacy of a righteous person, there are certain things that everybody can internalize. That's Aharon and the Big Day Kahuna. But there are other things in the legacy that are going to be reserved for the special few. And that's Miriam and the Para Aduma. That's the connection between these two. Okay. Okay. So this is one opinion, that the death of the righteous secures atonement, and the connection between Miriam's death and the Para Aduma. As I said to you, this is a Jewish concept. What differentiates this from a non-Jewish concept of someone dying for the sins of the people is that in that situation, they believe, and you'll correct me if I'm wrong, but they believe that this particular individual sacrificed his life. It was his decision to sacrifice his life to atone for others. And that's often referred to as he chose to do that. He chose to give his life to atone for others. That's a very anti-Jewish idea, right? We are not allowed to choose to give up our lives, right? For the sins of other people, it's not comprehensible. We are, in fact, commanded to give up our life sometimes in the area of the three cardinal transgressions of idol worship, sexual immorality, and murder. In other words, if somebody puts a gun to my head and says, if you don't worship that idol, I'm going to kill you, we have to allow ourselves to be killed. I mean, obviously you can try to kill him, but if you're not successful, in other words, you can't say I'm going to worship the idol, right? You have to allow yourself, I'm not going to worship that idol. If you get killed as a result of that, okay. I don't mean to be cavalier about that, right? But that's the idea. On the other hand, if somebody puts a gun to your head and says, mow your lawn on Shabbos, I guess it's great. Now call your gardener to come and mow your lawn on Shabbos. So I pick up the phone and call the gardener. You don't have to get killed for mowing your lawn, but you do have to get killed rather than worship an idol, or you have to get killed. If I put a gun to your head and I say, if you don't kill that person next to you, I'm going to kill you, nothing you can do. Right? And similarly, if I put a gun to your head and I say, you have to engage in relations with that married woman or I'm going to kill you. So nothing to do. But if I say to you, I'm going to kill you unless you, so that you can die for the sins of other people, you can't say, okay, go ahead and kill me. You can't give up your life, right? We don't give up. Miriam died at God's direction. Aaron died at God's direction. That's the concept that we have from a Jewish perspective, is that when righteous people die as God plans, it brings about atonement. Whether it brings about atonement in the way in which Rav Kook explains it, or in some other way, that's the idea, right? That when a person dies, when a righteous person dies in accordance with God's directive, that's what happens. Okay.
So, Rabbi, in one thing, connect Miriam and Para Aduma.
I thought I just did.
I'm a little confused because I can understand Miriam.
In other words, they came together. Why? To teach us. Just like the Para Aduma is able to wipe the slate clean, so too the death of righteous people is able to wipe the slate clean, okay? But there's another connection. There's another connection here. There's a connection that Rabbi Fran mentions, which is a fascinating connection. And he plays not so much on the idea that, play was the wrong word. He comments not so much on the idea that the Para Aduma brings about kapara, but he says, why is Miriam's death connected to this whole idea of the Para Aduma? So he says the Para Aduma is a chok, something that we've learned already, right? The Para Aduma is the chok par excellence. It is the exemplary act of doing something that we do not understand. But why do we do it? We do it because we believe in a system. We do it because God told us to do it. We don't understand how it works at all. This is the commandment that God gave. That's what we do. Says Rabbi Fran that Miriam's death is connected to the Para Aduma to teach us specifically the same thing about death. Meaning that we could look at this and say, hey, it's not fair that Miriam died, right? She didn't do anything wrong. She didn't transgress like her brothers transgressed, right? Why is Miriam dying? And Rafran gives the answer. It's connected to the Para Aduma to tell us that it's something that we accept, right? And we don't have a choice. It is something that we accept, that this is the way in which God runs the world, and it's something which we accept. Now, there are people who will tell you it's easier to accept when it's a parent who lived to 99 than it is when it's a child who died at 12. Okay? Whenever somebody says that, I always get a little bit, nervous. I think that these things are unique to the individual, right? Unique to the individual. It's hard to say, what's more painful, right? One over the other. I don't know. But the idea here, says Rabbi Frand, is that we can't begin to understand death or the suffering that precedes death. It's not fair. It doesn't make any sense. Why should this person suffer? This person was a good person, right? Why did they have to die now?
It's not a punishment. Is death a punishment?
We don't know. And so in other words, the idea here is that Rabbi Frand is telling us, just like we do the Para Aduma without understanding it, but because we accept it as part of the system that God gave us, so too when it comes to relating to death, says Rabbi Frand, we relate the same way. We don't understand it, right? Nobody understands death except after you die. And then you're not sharing it with anybody else, right? Nobody understands death before you die. So for us, it's difficult. It's incomprehensible. I mean, there might be times where it seems more logical than others, but death is basically incomprehensible. And says Rabbi Fran, the death of Miriam is connected to the Para Aduma to teach us that just like we accept the Para Aduma as part of this bigger system, so too we need to accept death as part of this bigger system. Now, you all know that because what happens when a person dies? So the family members who are obligated to mourn tear a garment, right? That's Kriya. You're pretty much familiar with that. They also make a bracha. It's not a bracha over the Kriya, but it's a bracha. What's the bracha? Baruch atah Hashem Elokeinu melech haolam dayan ha'emes. What does it mean to make a bracha of dayan ha'emes? That God is the true judge. Right? It's acknowledging that I accept this death. I might not be happy about it. It might make me very sad, but I live in this system. I accept this death. At the grave, after the burial is complete, we say something called tziduk hadin. Hatzor tamim pa'alo, right? These whole few paragraphs of tziduk hadin. What is the essence of tziduk hadin? The essence is acceptance. That I accept, God, that you that you were responsible for this, and I accept this death. I'm not, again, I might not be happy about it. I might be overwhelmed. I might be sad. But I accept that it is part of this system. Accept it as part of the system. So Rabbi Fran connects the two in that particular way. Okay, kept you long enough.
Yes.
Have a good week, and I will see you in Yirtzeh Hashem next week.
I tried to connect with this class last week. I couldn't get it.
You couldn't get in? What happened?